An introduction to C.S. Lewis. Known to friends and family as Jack, a name he gave himself as a child, Clive Staples Lewis, 1898 to 1963, is best known for writing the Chronicles of Narnia book series. After a brief stint as a philosophy lecturer at Oxford University, Lewis became a professor of English literature, first at Oxford and then at Cambridge, publishing several well-regarded works. But Lewis wrote in many different genres, including autobiography, poetry, literary criticism, fantasy and science fiction, philosophy, theology, and apologetics. This breadth of work and the quality of his prose help to explain why Lewis is recognised as the most influential Christian apologist of the 20th century. Indeed, Lewis is recognised as an influential thinker in several disciplines, and his work is widely discussed by contemporary academics. Particularly noteworthy is his book The Abolition of Man, a critique of relativism and its potential consequences, originally given as the Riddell Memorial Lectures at King's College, Newcastle in 1943. National Review ranked the book number 7 in its 100 best non-fiction books of the 20th century. According to Michael Ward, though The Abolition of Man is one of Lewis's shortest books, it is also one of the most important and influential. And Lewis is well known in apologetical and some philosophical circles for his discussion of the argument from reason. Featured, for example, as one of the chapters in his book Miracles. Lewis's argument from reason against naturalism and for theism continues to be discussed amongst philosophers. You can see some of those books on screen there. Besides the breadth and literary quality of his output, other factors contributing to Lewis's influence are his education, life experience, and the people who were key influences upon his thinking. Let's go back to Lewis's childhood. He was born into a non-partisan Protestant family in Belfast. During a time of influenza, Lewis and his older brother Warnie were forced to stay indoors and entertain themselves. Influenced by Beatrix Potter's recently published animal stories, Lewis wrote about Animal Land, including details about its economics, politics, government, and history, as well as making illustrations of buildings and characters. The world of Boxen was created when Jack's stories about Animal Land and Warnie's stories about India were brought together. Lewis's mother, Flora, died of cancer in August of 1908. In September, Lewis's father, Albert, sent him to England to attend the same private boarding school as his older brother, Warren. Unfortunately, the school that Albert Lewis, after careful study and deep reflection, chose for his sons was run quite autocratically by a man, Anglican priest Robert Capron, who had already been prosecuted for cruelty to his students and who, within a very few years, would be certified as insane. Lewis later described the students there as beaten, cheated, scared, ill-fed. Lewis lost his childhood faith at Cherbourg House boarding school, becoming an atheist at age 14. As Lewis wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves when he was 18 years old, "I believe in no religion. There's absolutely no proof for any of them, and from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions are merely man's own invention." After several private schools and a formative period with private tutor William T. Kirkpatrick, Lewis enrolled at Oxford University. There he enlisted in the British Army 3 years after the outbreak of World War I in 1914. He was commissioned an officer and reached the front line in the Somme Valley in France on his 19th birthday. As Lewis later recalled in his autobiography, I have gone to sleep marching and woken again and found myself marching still. One walked in the trenches in thigh gum boots with water above the knee. One remembers the icy stream welling up inside the boot when you punctured it on concealed barbed wire. Familiarity both with the very old and the very recent dead. The frights, the cold, the smell of high explosive, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles, the sitting or standing corpses, the landscape of sheer earth without a blade of grass, the boots worn day and night till they seem to grow to your feet. All this often seems to have happened to someone else. Well, Lewis was wounded during the Battle of Arras in April and May 1917. As they advanced with bayonets at the ready, the barrage stopped advancing and began to come backwards towards them. Soon, Jack and his men were being bombarded by their own artillery from behind them, and to his helpless fury, Jack watched his men being blown to pieces in the constant roar of their own artillery support. Suddenly, Jack saw a blinding light, everything went completely silent, and then the ground came up slowly and hit him in the face. Jack had been hit by both the concussion and shrapnel from a British shell. His trusted sergeant had been between Jack and the shell when it exploded and was blown to bits. So Lewis was hospitalized, and that was the end of his participation in World War I. He had some shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life because it was simply too close to his heart to operate at the time. In hospital, Lewis read some G.K. Chesterton, who was a noted Catholic apologist. In reading Chesterton, I did not know what I was letting myself in for, wrote Lewis. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, was quite influential on Lewis, making him think that Christianity was very sensible, apart from its Christianity. Lewis's worldview beliefs underwent several shifts in the 1920s, and he came to believe in a god in 1930, and then later he became a Christian in 1931. As an atheist, Lewis was committed to the materialistic, naturalistic worldview as described by the noted philosopher Bertrand Russell in a famous 1903 essay where he wrote, "Man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. The whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins." At this time, Lewis later reported, "Nearly all that I loved I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless." However, even as an atheist, Lewis rejected scientism, the theory of knowledge according to which, as Russell wrote in 1935, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. Well, Lewis thought that scientism has too narrow an understanding of knowledge, because it can't accommodate moral and aesthetic knowledge, or the intuition of logical principles required for logical argumentation. The distinction thus made between scientific and non-scientific thoughts will not easily bear the weight we're attempting to put on it. This rejection of scientism allowed Lewis to take philosophical arguments seriously. So Lewis argued himself out of his belief in materialism before he argued himself into a belief in God. His objections to naturalism, which are still part of the contemporary discussion, were principally concerned with the problems posed for naturalism by the existence of objective values on the one hand and of reason on the other. For Lewis, evil was an objectively real fact, a real thing, as he wrote, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. As an atheist, Lewis believed that evil was something that a god ought not to permit, and that the existence of evil therefore justified his atheism. As he said in The Problem of Pain, if anyone had asked me, "Why do you not believe in God?" my reply would have run something like this. If you ask me to believe that this universe is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. However, Lewis wondered, how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it didn't happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. Lewis writes about having true beliefs. He says, we're compelled to admit between the thoughts of a terrestrial astronomer and the behaviour of matter several light years away that particular relation we call truth. But this relation has no meaning at all if we try and make it exist between the matter of the star and the astronomer's brain, considered as a lump of matter. The brain may be in all sorts of relations to the star, no doubt. It's in a spatial relation and a time relation. But to talk of one bit of matter as being true about another bit of matter seems to me to be nonsense. Indeed, Lewis observes that acts of thinking are no doubt events, but they're very special sorts of events. They are about something other than themselves and can be true or false. However, physical events are not about anything and cannot be true or false. Hence, thinking events in our minds cannot be nothing but physical events in our brains. Lewis argues that in this statement, I believe X because of Y, two different relations might be meant by the words because of. There's the relation of physical cause and effect, as in the explanation, grandfather is ill today because, cause and effect, he ate lobster yesterday. Now, you could mean the relation of logical ground and logical consequent, as in the inference, grandfather must be ill because, ground consequent, he hasn't got up yet, and we know he is invariably an early riser when he is well. You see, failure to get out of bed doesn't cause grandfather to be ill, nor does it cause us to conclude he is ill. Rather, it is our rational grounds for making the logical inference that he is ill. If what we think at the end of our reasoning is to be a valid conclusion, argues Lewis, the correct answer to the question, why do you think this, must begin with the ground consequent because. On the other hand, every event in nature must be connected with previous events in the cause and effect relation. But if naturalism is true, our acts of thinking are events in nature. And therefore, the true answer to why do you think this must begin with the cause-effect sense of because. Well, this is obviously a problem because, in the ground consequent sense, to be caused is not to be proved. Wishful thinkings, prejudices, and the delusions of madness are all caused, but they are ungrounded. Even having come to believe in a God, Lewis still had to reckon with what he made of Jesus Christ. Lewis loved pagan mythology, seeing them as stories that were not true, but which nevertheless conveyed important universal truths about the human condition. And Lewis saw the Christian story about Jesus as another myth, and thus not a historically true reality. Also, in discussion with Christian friends Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, yes, that Tolkien, author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, Lewis came to think that the Gospel might be historical, but without losing its mythic character. Lewis came to see the Gospel as myth become fact. As he wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves in October of 1931, my puzzle was, in what sense the life and death of Christ saved or opened salvation to the world. Now, what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. Again, that if I met the idea of a god sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving god, say Balder, Adonis, Bacchus, similarly moved me, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. The reason was that in pagan stories, I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. In The Everlasting Man, G.K. Chesterton had written that it were better to rend our robes with a great cry against blasphemy, or to lay hold of the man as a maniac, rather than to stand stupidly debating when a strolling carpenter's apprentice said calmly and almost carelessly, "Before Abraham was, I am." Well, Lewis took up this line of thought in Mere Christianity, writing, "I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God." Well, that's the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on the level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or he would be the devil of hell. You must take your choice. Either this was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. Or you can shut him up for a fool, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. In 1941, Lewis responded to an invitation to speak to Royal Air Force personnel across Britain. And this gave Lewis the opportunity to learn how to talk about Christianity to people without a private education who'd not attended Oxford University. He later wrote, "Our business, as apologists, is to present that which is timeless in the particular language of our own age. We must learn the language of our audience by experience. You must translate every bit of your theology into the vernacular. This is very troublesome, and it means you can say very little in half an hour, but it is essential. It's also the greatest service to your own thought. I have come to the conviction that if you cannot translate your thoughts into uneducated language, then your thoughts were confused." Lewis published The Problem of Pain in 1940 as an exercise in Christian apologetics. But he had experienced pain and loss in his life, and he later wrote a deeply personal and honest account of his grief at the loss of his wife, the poet Joy Gresham Davidman, whom he married late in life, to cancer, of course the same disease that took his mother. Having been impressed by The Problem of Pain, the director of religious broadcasting at the British Broadcasting Corporation wrote to Lewis in 1941, inviting him to give a series of radio talks. Well, Lewis ended up doing 4 series, broadcast from August of 1941 to April of 1944, giving 25 talks of 10 to 15 minutes. The first 2 sets of talks were published as Broadcast Talks in 1942. Third and fourth series, with some additional material, were published as Christian Behaviour in 43 and Beyond Personality in 44. And then in 1952, all 3 books were published as one volume, lightly edited by Lewis, with a preface explaining what he meant by his new title, Mere Christianity. During the first 15 years of the 21st century, Mere Christianity sold over 3.5 million copies in English alone, and it has been translated into over 30 languages. In 1947, Lewis was the cover story in Time magazine. Lewis is one of a growing band of heretics amongst modern intellectuals, read the article. An intellectual who believes in God. The article described Lewis as the most popular lecturer in the university, a best-selling author, and one of the most influential spokesmen for Christianity in the English-speaking world, and noted his special gift for dramatizing Christian dogma. Like another eloquent and witty popularizer of Christianity, the late G.K. Chesterton, he has a talent for putting old-fashioned truths in a modern idiom. So, Lewis rejected scientism and argued himself out of the naturalistic worldview, in part because he thought it couldn't accommodate values or reason. And then Lewis concluded that the most reasonable way to locate values and reason in one's worldview is to locate them in the existence of God. Lewis came to see the gospel as myth become fact, in part due to the influence of reading G.K. Chesterton, in part due to the conversations with Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, thereby reconciling the split he had experienced between the things he loved and the things he thought were real. Lewis is thought that his writings would be forgotten within 5 years of his death. His books have sold 250 million copies worldwide, and the sales increase each year. even 6 decades after his death in 1963. Lewis's lasting influence can be explained in terms of the breadth and quality of his speaking and writing, his formal and informal education with a focus on literature, mythology, and philosophy, his life experience, including his experiencing loss and suffering in World War One, and his key influences, classical authors like Plato and Boethius, modern writers like Arthur Balfour, G.K. Chesterton, Kenneth Grahame, George MacDonald, Beatrix Potter, and Dorothy L. Sayers, and friends like Owen Barfield, Hugo Dyson, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Charles Williams, the novelist, who together formed a literary group called the Inklings. On November the 22nd in 2013, I attended a service in Westminster Abbey in London, commemorating the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death. A memorial stone in Lewis's honour was unveiled, placing his legacy alongside that of many other writers who are revered there. The memorial carried a quotation from Lewis worth pondering. "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else."